A gentleman should never notice the companion. He certainly should never feel his pulse quicken when she speaks. Yet, when Lord James Ashford returned to Wynthorpe, he found himself utterly consumed by the new fixture in his aunt's household. Miss Charlotte Harland possessed a grace too profound, a wit too sharp, and a secret too dangerous for her station. She was forced to hide the truth of her identity, that she was the wealthy, presumed dead heiress, Charlotte Ravensleigh. He, in turn, was determined to expose her lie. But as their gazes met over a forgotten book, they discovered a terrifying complication. They were destined to destroy each other's security, or, impossibly, to ignite a passion too real to be denied. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Didn't Belong There. The carriage, smelling faintly of damp leather and old wool, drew to a rattling halt before the great, somber gates of Wynthorpe Manor. Miss Charlotte Harland smoothed the simple, unrelieved gray of her traveling dress, a garment chosen specifically for its forgettable quality, and took a breath that did little to settle the nervous tremor in her hands. Wynthorpe was magnificent in its gloom, a testament to ancestral wealth and perhaps stubborn pride. It was precisely the sort of place a woman like her might be employed, and equally the kind of place she ought to have avoided entirely. Miss Charlotte Harland was, officially, a paid companion. She possessed the necessary quiet manners, the passable French, and the ability to fade gracefully into the background. Yet a discerning eye might note the subtle tilt of her chin, the innate musicality in her voice, and the devastating elegance that not even a decade of practiced humility could entirely erase. And this truly was the danger, for Charlotte Harland was merely a convenient fabrication, a quiet, temporary shield. The truth resided in the depths of her remarkable hazel eyes. She was Charlotte Ravensleigh, the very same heiress who had been mourned, sermonized over, and officially declared lost to the cruel, cold sea 12 long years prior. Only she knew that the grave marker was a lie. She had survived the shipwreck, had been taken in by the kindest souls, and had sworn a silent, unbreakable vow to remain dead to the world. A profound and intricate set of circumstances, tied to a dangerous inheritance and avaricious guardians, made her continued silence the only surety of peace. She was a ghost, walking in daylight, and she could not afford to be seen. Her employer, Lady Agatha Wynthorpe, was waiting in the small receiving parlor. She was a woman of 90 years, sharp-tongued, sharp-eyed, and lonely in the manner of those who have outlived all their peers. "You are late, Miss Harland," Lady Agatha announced, without preamble or greeting, surveying Charlotte through a silver lorgnet. "I detest tardiness. I hired a companion, not a fashionable delay." "My sincerest apologies, my lady," Charlotte replied, her voice soft but steady. "The road outside Salisbury was impassable after the morning rains." Lady Agatha merely sniffed, letting the lorgnet drop. "Well, you are here now. You may read the Times until your eyes cross, and tell me if the world has stopped being foolish. And mind your place, Miss Harland. My last companion felt the need to offer opinions. I have enough of those myself, thank you."
Charlotte bowed her head in acceptance. She had been hired to be invisible, useful, and silent. And if she played her part well, no one would look closely enough to discover that the woman seated in the stiff chair, reading aloud the tedious political reports, was far too gentle, far too intelligent, and indeed far too elegant to be a mere companion. The unexpected happened not a day later. It was during the late afternoon, as Charlotte was dutifully cataloguing Lady Agatha's extensive yet remarkably dull collection of pressed botanical specimens, that the commotion began. The sound of a carriage, much grander and certainly faster than Charlotte's own, screeching to a halt on the gravel drive, startled the entire household. "Good heavens!" Lady Agatha muttered, dropping a valuable volume of Linnaeus. "The fool is home. Why must he never give notice?" The fool entered the parlors seconds later. Lord James Ashford, Lady Agatha's nephew, was the temporary master of Wynthorpe, and, as Charlotte instantly recognized, a polished, reserved, and devastatingly handsome man who carried the unmistakable air of having seen the world and found most of it wanting. He had been abroad, managing inherited interests in the colonies, and his return was entirely unexpected. He stopped just inside the doorway. His gaze swept the room with an almost clinical efficiency, taking in the dropped book, the startled maid, and finally settling on Charlotte. And upon meeting Charlotte, he paused. He didn't merely glance. He studied her. James Ashford was afflicted with a chronic habit of observing everything. He was a man who saw past the veneer, whose intellect demanded clarity and truth. And in the subtle lines of her face, the way she instinctively held her slender spine, the quality of light in her eyes, he found a profound disturbance.
He frowned, a deep, momentary furrow above a straight aristocratic nose. There was something familiar here, something that snagged on a memory he had long filed away. During his travels, years ago, he had encountered a peculiar painting in a private Callian collection, an extraordinary portrait commissioned by a minor nobleman who was distantly related to one of the lost English families. The subject was a girl of 10, painted with an almost alarming vividness. A girl with those exact eyes. The lost heiress, Charlotte Ravensleigh. The image had haunted him for years, a ghost in oils. And now, the woman before him, dressed in the self-effacing uniform of a companion, was its living echo. "A new fixture, Aunt?" James asked, his voice low and smooth as polished steel. "This is Miss Harland, James, my companion. She reads the papers and fetches my knitting. Try not to frighten her with your excessive globe-trotting." James did not move, his dark eyes never leaving Charlotte's. The polite, expected response was lost to him. He was a man who possessed a finely tuned antenna for inconsistencies, and this woman was a walking contradiction. "Miss Harland," he acknowledged, with a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head. It was not a greeting. It was an interrogation. Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. She managed a small curtsy, forcing her composure to reassert itself. "My lord." She held his gaze for only a second too long, her heart a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. "He sees too much." Charlotte's first evening in the manor was a trial by fire. Lady Agatha retired early, leaving Charlotte and Lord Ashford to a strained, solitary dinner in the vast dining room. The polished mahogany table seemed to stretch for miles between them. The tension was immediate and palpable. James made no attempt at polite conversation, preferring instead to simply watch her. He observed the precise, delicate manner in which she handled her cutlery, not the hurried, rough movements of a woman who had worked for her bread, but the ingrained grace of one bred to a different class. When he finally spoke, his question was seemingly innocuous. "I find Miss Harland's French to be flawless, Aunt," James remarked, addressing the absent Lady Agatha. "A surprisingly rare quality in a companion. Where did you acquire your education, Miss Harland? Charlotte felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She had anticipated simple questions, her age, her references, not a direct query into her breeding. She fabricated quickly. I was educated in a small academy for young ladies near Bath, my lord. The curriculum was thorough. James raised a skeptical brow, but his eyes never left hers. Indeed. And I observe you have a remarkable grasp of the classics. You referred to an obscure passage of Horace this afternoon, one that few gentlemen, let alone a lady from a small academy near Bath, would recognize. He was baiting her, testing the edges of her disguise. She drew upon every ounce of her fabricated persona, forcing a tone of humble self-effacement. My father had a considerable library, my lord. I merely spent a great deal of time among the dust jackets. Ah, I see. A library. One wonders how a lady so accustomed to dusty pursuits came to be at sea. If I may be so bold as to ask for the details of your previous service. Charlotte's breath caught. He knew nothing, yet his words felt like a direct hit. She looked down at her plate, the deception feeling suddenly cheap and flimsy. Her poise was unmistakably aristocratic. Her knowledge of literature and languages was far too refined. James was no fool. He began to suspect she was far more than she pretended, that the story of Miss Harland was a carefully constructed fiction. He suspected she was a woman of fortune, hiding from fate. Later that evening, after administering Lady Agatha's nightly draught and being dismissed, Charlotte took a solitary walk. The air in the manor was stifling. She needed space to gather her composure after James's relentless observation. She wandered through the long, echoing portrait gallery, a place usually avoided by the servants. The ancestors of Wynthorpe stared down at her in various states of powdered formality. She turned a corner and froze. There, amidst the Wynthorpe line, was a single, smaller portrait of a child, hung inexplicably in an alcove. It was the daughter of a cousin of Lady Agatha's, a distant branch of the Wynthorpe family who had married a Ravensleigh. The subject was a girl of 10, dressed in an unnaturally adult velvet gown, clutching a small, worn volume. But it was not the clothing that stopped Charlotte's heart. It was the eyes. Her eyes. It was a girl of 10 with her same eyes, her same smile. The portrait of her own cousin, a girl who, like herself, was lost to the sea. A memory that was a sliver of her own childhood. She was staring at a face that was almost her own, a constant reminder of the life she'd left behind. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers stopping just short of the canvas, visibly shaken, tears pricking her eyes. A voice, deep and close, cut through the silence. "Do you see the resemblance, Miss Harland?" James had been following her. He stood in the arched doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the corridor. His gaze shifted from the portrait to Charlotte, then back again. Charlotte spun around, wiping her eyes with a hasty hand. "My lord, you startled me. No resemblance at all. It is simply a very sad face, I think. She looks lost." "She was lost," James murmured, taking a deliberate step closer. Her family never recovered the body. An orphan, taken in by distant relatives, then lost to a tempest. A tale of great tragedy. He paused, his expression unreadable. "And yet, Miss Harland, I find it quite remarkable. She has your exact chin, and your breathlessness." "I am merely tired," Charlotte insisted, the denial coming too quickly, too breathlessly. He looked at her with an intensity that demanded honesty. "I rarely believe in mere coincidence, Miss Harland. Do you?" The encounter in the gallery cemented James' suspicions. He watched Charlotte retreat, a fragile construct of composure barely masking a profound inner turmoil. The pieces did not fit. A paid companion did not stare at an ancestral portrait with the agonizing familiarity of a ghost revisiting her past. He began to question why a woman of such inherent grace would hide her origins. What fear, what grave necessity would compel her to trade a life of privilege for the daily, grinding humility of a paid servant? It was a mystery that appealed to his highly ordered, curious mind, and one he found himself utterly consumed by. Charlotte, meanwhile, retreated to her small, cold chamber, staring out at the moonlit grounds. Lord Ashford was more than an employer. He was a spy, a relentless observer who saw the truth even when she kept her mouth shut. He was the greatest danger to her carefully constructed life, a life where anonymity meant safety. Yet, a dangerous countercurrent was beginning to flow. When James's eyes met hers, it was not merely scrutiny she felt, it was recognition. He did not look at her as a servant or even as an anomaly. He looked at her as a person. She realized with a terrifying jolt that James Ashford was perhaps the only man who made her feel truly seen. And being truly seen, after so long, was a perilous comfort. The manor was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock downstairs. James stood in his study, staring into the heart of a dying fire, the image of the portrait and the companion superimposed in his mind. He spoke the words quietly to the empty room, a vow made to his own insistent curiosity. "I will uncover who she is, no matter what it costs." In her small chamber above, Charlotte clutched the rough linen of her curtain, her own whisper barely audible. No matter what, he must never know. Chapter 2. A lord should not desire a woman who lies. He did not cease his subtle scrutiny, rather, he deepened it. Now, however, the observation was tinged with something warmer, more complicated, and infinitely more dangerous than mere curiosity. James found himself consumed. He would seek out her company, not overtly, which would betray his fascination to Lady Agatha, but through calculated coincidence. He would materialize in the library when she was shelving books, or arrive in the sitting room precisely when she was reading aloud. Their conversations, once strained interrogations, became lively intellectual fencing matches. Charlotte was forced to constantly monitor every opinion, every reference, lest she betray the depths of her education. Yet, even under such strict self-control, James could elicit genuine wit and profound insight from her. He found her presence too calming to his restless spirit, and her beauty, the kind that did not demand attention, but quietly commanded it, was too distracting to his finely tuned intellect. Every stolen moment together felt charged, an energy thrumming beneath the surface that was too intimate for employer and companion. James, a man typically aloof and reserved, realized with a jolt of alarm that he was not merely investigating her, he was being drawn into her orbit. Despite his suspicions, he could not resist Charlotte. Charlotte felt the attraction too. It was a slow, consuming heat, entirely unwelcome, yet utterly irresistible. James's eyes, when fixed upon her, stripped away the artifice of Miss Harland and spoke directly to the heart of Charlotte Ravensleigh. With him, she felt an authenticity she hadn't dared to claim in 12 years. The desire was a constant, sharp ache. But she forced herself to remember the cold, hard facts. She cannot fall in love, not while inhabiting a lie, not when the world and indeed the law believed she was dead. Falling for James would mean risking her secret, her safety, and potentially the future of the kind family who had sheltered her. James's investigation proceeded with the stealth and precision of a military campaign. He knew she was Charlotte Ravensleigh. The resemblance to the portrait and the glaring inconsistencies in her past were conclusive enough for his logical mind, but he needed proof of why she was hiding. The opportunity arose during a dreary, rain-soaked morning. Lady Agatha had requested a specific volume of Lord Byron's poetry, bound in faded green leather. James searched through a crowded shelf of her personal books in the smaller morning room. As he pulled the volume free, an old, brittle piece of paper slipped from the pages and fluttered to the carpet. James retrieved it. It was a letter, yellowed and fragile, folded many times over. The handwriting was elegant but slightly erratic, a man writing in haste or under duress. The address was simply to C.R. Safe Harbor via private courier. James read it twice. The reference to an arranged inheritance and a child stolen away was chilling. It confirmed his every suspicion. Charlotte was hiding not merely to avoid responsibility, but to survive a financial conspiracy that had potentially engineered the shipwreck itself. The initials matched Charlotte Ravensleigh. The urgency of the words perfectly explained the necessity of Miss Harland's quiet grave. The fragile balance of Wynthorpe was shattered by a new arrival, Lady Eleanor Harbury. Eleanor was stunning, possessed of impeccable lineage, and armed with the conviction that Lord James Ashford was her destiny, or at the very least, her most desirable asset. She had arrived at the estate with a clear objective: to secure James as her husband before his prolonged bachelorhood became a permanent habit. James, though civil, was entirely immune to Eleanor's practiced charm. But Eleanor was not unintelligent. It took her precisely one luncheon to recognize the threat posed by the quiet companion. She watched the subtle flicker of James's attention whenever Charlotte moved. She saw the intense, private quality of their accidental conversations. Charlotte's quiet dignity did not signify submission to Eleanor. It signified a dangerous, veiled strength. Upon noticing Charlotte, Eleanor's instincts sharpened. She immediately sensed danger. This woman was too elegant, too serene, and too noticed by James to be a mere servant. Eleanor, armed with cutting sweetness, began her subtle attack. She engaged Charlotte in conversation, asking questions that were seemingly benign but designed to expose cracks in her facade. "My dear Miss Harland, you speak with the purest accent. Where did you reside before coming to Wynthorpe? The country, I presume?" Eleanor inquired, tilting her head. "In Surrey, my lady," Charlotte replied calmly, meeting her gaze.
"Ah, Surrey. I have friends there. Do tell me the name of your former employer. I may know them. One likes to ensure one is hiring a woman of impeccable background, does one not?" Charlotte felt a cold dread. She had meticulously fabricated a deceased former mistress. "The circumstances were unfortunate, my lady. My former employer, the late Mrs. Selby, passed away quite suddenly last winter. I regret I have no references other than those presented to Lady Agatha." Eleanor's smile did not reach her eyes. "How very tragic, and how very convenient. Do continue to fetch the tea, Miss Harland. We are discussing the Italian opera, a subject that I am certain is quite beyond the scope of one's former duties. Eleanor, with every barbed word and pointed query, vowed to expose the pretender and eliminate the rival. That evening, a violent thunderstorm broke over Wynthorpe. The wind howled through the ancient chimneys, and the fierce crashes of thunder reduced the frail Lady Agatha to a state of debilitating terror. "The piano, Harland! Play the piano! Loudly! Drown out the noise!" Lady Agatha cried, clutching Charlotte's sleeve. Charlotte hesitated. Playing the piano was an indulgence she had long denied herself. Her musical education was as aristocratic as her French. To play with true skill would be to give away yet another clue. But Lady Agatha's fear was genuine. Charlotte acquiesced. She moved to the drawing-room piano, her fingers tracing the keys. Then, letting go of caution for the first time in years, she began to play. It was a Chopin nocturne, rich, complex, and filled with the melancholy that spoke of loss and desperate hope. Her skill was far beyond what a paid companion should possess. It was the talent of a woman trained by the masters, whose very soul was poured into the music. James, drawn from the library by the sudden, magnificent sound, stood in the doorway, entranced. Eleanor, who had been attempting to engage him in a discussion of their potential wedding arrangements, was entirely forgotten. He walked across the room, the noise of the storm and the music washing over him. He moved silently, halting beside the bench. Charlotte's head was bowed, her expression luminous in the candlelight. He knelt down beside her, his breath close to her ear. "Who taught you to play like that?" he whispered, the sound barely audible over the crescendo of the music and the rain. It was not a question of inquiry, it was a demand for truth. Charlotte's fingers faltered on the keys. She looked at him, her eyes wide, vulnerable, and shining with unshed tears. The intimacy of the moment, the storm, the shared silence within the music, broke her resolve. She answered, her voice trembling, dangerously soft. "Someone I lost." Their hands were resting inches apart on the ivory keys. Their hands brushed. It was a fleeting contact, electric and profound. Their breath hitched in perfect unison, the desire they had fought so hard becoming a tangible third presence in the room. From the shadow of the doorway, Eleanor Harbury witnessed the exchange, the nearness, the whisper, and the devastating vulnerability in the companion's eyes and the possessive intensity in James's. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the quiet companion was the single greatest obstacle to her ambition. Eleanor saw it and vowed to destroy Charlotte. James left the next morning without ceremony, claiming necessary business in London. His true purpose was not trade or finance, but the final, necessary piece of proof. He was now certain the connection was too strong, the clues too overwhelming to be coincidence. Charlotte the companion was the missing heiress. He traveled to the ruined, distant Ravensleigh estate, now nothing but a charred shell of masonry and bitter memories. He interviewed old solicitors, discreetly questioned former servants, and researched shipping manifests and inheritance records. The journey was exhaustive, but the results were irrefutable. He uncovered records of the elaborate financial maneuvering that followed the Ravensleigh deaths. He found details of a specific non-transferable marriage settlement tied to a single surviving heir. And he found undeniable physical evidence, a locket, recovered from the wreckage and identified by a former maid.
that had been inscribed with the date of the child's 10th birthday and the initials CR. The evidence made one thing unmistakably clear. Charlotte the companion is the missing heiress. He returned to Wynthorpe Manor late that night. The house was utterly silent, wrapped in the cold security of late hours. James shed his greatcoat, took a candle, and walked quietly through the lower halls. He knew where she would be. The library was her sanctuary, the one place she felt she could shed the disguise of Miss Harland and breathe in the company of honest books. He found her seated in a large leather armchair, a volume of poetry open on her lap, gazing into the cold hearth. She looked exhausted, vulnerable, and utterly alone. James set the candle down on the corner table, the small flare of light causing Charlotte to gasp and look up. He stood over her, his shadow enveloping her. The moment stretched, thick with dread and anticipation. He held the silence for a long, aching moment, his expression a mixture of profound relief and consuming regret. Then, his voice was quiet, final, and utterly devastating. I know who you are.
Chapter 3. The Heiress, the Lie, and the Love that was always meant. The three simple words hung in the silence of the library, heavier and more potent than any accusation. I know who you are. Charlotte's heart seized. She did not attempt to deny it. The battle had been lost the moment James knelt beside her at the piano. The intense scrutiny, the veiled questions, the quiet moments of shared understanding, they had led inevitably to this ruinous confrontation. Tears, which she had successfully denied herself for 12 years, now sprang to her eyes, blurring the resolute features of the man standing before her. She closed the book in her lap, her hands shaking, and finally she broke. Yes, she whispered, the admission a raw tear in the fabric of her carefully constructed life. I am Charlotte Ravensleigh. She told him everything, the fury of the tempest, the rescue by a humble, kind fishing family who raised her as their own daughter, the constant fear of being discovered. The inheritance, she explained, was a curse. I hid James because I had to, she confessed, the tears finally spilling over. The men who claimed my fortune after the shipwreck, they were my guardians. They stood to lose everything if I survived. They never searched for me because they knew I was worth more to them dead. If I reclaim my name, I will expose them, yes, but I will also drag my rescuers into a scandal they do not deserve. I cannot claim my inheritance. It will destroy everything my rescuers gave me, their peace, their small, safe life. James moved swiftly, kneeling before her, grasping her hands. You are asking me to believe that you choose penury and hiding over a fortune that is rightfully yours. I choose safety and peace over fire and gold, she choked out. James looked at her, and in his eyes she found not judgment, but deep, protecting resolve. Then you shall have both. I promise you, Charlotte, I will protect your truth, and I will protect the people who saved you. He was still holding her hands, his thumb tracing a steady pattern across her skin, when the faint sound of footsteps receded rapidly down the corridor outside the library. But Eleanor overheard. The next morning broke clear and bright, entirely belying the impending disaster. Wynthorpe Manor hosted a small but significant luncheon,
a gathering of prominent families from the neighboring estates. The atmosphere was one of polite formality, a perfect stage for drama. Charlotte, unnerved by the prior night's confession, felt dread clinging to her like a shroud. She was serving tea, attempting to milk back into the anonymity of Miss Harland, when Lady Eleanor Harbury rose from her seat at the far end of the table. Eleanor was radiant in emerald silk, her smile sharp and triumphant. She raised her wineglass, ostensibly for a toast, but her eyes were fixed on Charlotte. "A toast," Eleanor announced, her voice ringing clearly across the polished table, "to new acquaintances, especially those who bring with them such extraordinary tales." She took a slow, deliberate sip. Then she turned her focus entirely on Charlotte. "This woman," Eleanor declared, pointing a perfectly gloved hand, "is not a companion. She is Charlotte Ravensleigh, the lost heiress." The effect was instantaneous and explosive. Gasps, the polite hum of conversation died instantly. The luncheon devolved into chaos. Silverware clattered and ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths. Lord Ashford, who had been sitting opposite Eleanor, shot to his feet with a thunderous expression, but he was too late. "It is a fraud," Eleanor pressed, her voice escalating. "She faked her death to escape debts, or perhaps worse, she has insinuated herself here under false pretenses, an insult to Lady Agatha and a deception to the entire county." Accusations of deception and whispers of imposture flew across the room. Charlotte felt the humiliation crash over her. Every eye was fixed on her, appraising, judging, condemning. The carefully constructed piece of her life was dissolving in the cruel light of exposure. Unable to face the wave of scrutiny and shame, Charlotte dropped the tea service she held, the sound of splintering porcelain barely audible over the sudden, violent surge of whispers. She clapped a hand over her mouth and fled the room, running blindly toward the back stairwell and the sanctuary of the dark, cold gardens. James did not follow Charlotte. He understood she needed space to confront the wreckage of her security. Instead, he remained in the dining room, his gaze fixed on Eleanor with an icy contempt that promised retribution. "You have gone too far, Eleanor," he stated quietly, addressing the room but only looking at her, "and you are utterly wrong." He then launched his own counterattack, using the proofs he had gathered in his travels. He had not only found the letter, but had also identified the conspirators, two elderly, seemingly respectable gentlemen, Mr. Hawthorne and Mr. Davies, the very same men who had been Charlotte's legal guardians and had profited immensely from her presumed death. James left the manor immediately and confronted the old Ravensleigh guardians who profited from her presumed death. He discovered they were involved in the original shipwreck, a deliberate act of negligence designed to secure the inheritance, and they were now conspiring to permanently silence any rumor of her survival, or worse, to keep her quiet forever.
The following day, James moved with relentless efficiency. He presented his evidence, the letter, the recovered locket, the shipping records showing manipulated manifests, to a judge in the county court, then published a succinct, damning announcement in the Times. He exposed them publicly, detailing their financial avarice and their criminal negligence in the disappearance of the heiress. Within a day, their reputation was destroyed, their assets were frozen, and their power was utterly dismantled. The true villains were revealed, and the public gaze shifted from Charlotte's flight to the guardian's crimes. Charlotte remained hidden for 3 days in the cottage of a distant, trusted estate worker. She was safe, but utterly adrift. The storm had passed, but her future was still undecided. She had to make a choice: remain a hidden woman with a simple life, perhaps returning to her adopted family,
forever Miss Harland, safe but forever denying the woman she was meant to be. Or reclaim her title, face the inevitable scandal, the public spotlight, and the heavy responsibilities and dangers that came with being the Ravensleigh heiress. She feared the responsibility and loathed the attention. Simplicity called to her, whispering of peace. But the choice was taken from her. A messenger arrived, pale and shaken. The ousted guardians, desperate and cornered, had attempted a final, cowardly act of vengeance. They had confronted James on a lonely road near Wynthorpe. When James was nearly attacked by the same men who destroyed her family, she realized the truth. Her hiding was no longer a shield. It was a burden that forced others, including the man she loved, to pay the price for her silence. She could not hide while James risked his life for her.
Charlotte rode back to Wynthorpe, no longer in the anonymity of a companion's gown, but wearing a determination that spoke of battle. She was no longer Miss Harland. She found James in the manor, recovering from the struggle, his face bruised but his eyes fiercely relieved to see her. She walked past him, a small, dramatic gesture of reclaiming her past. She walked into the portrait gallery, the long hall where James had first pierced her disguise. She stood once more before the portrait of the 10-year-old girl. She touched the cool canvas of her younger self, her eyes wet with sudden acceptance. "I am ready to be her again," she whispered, the words a silent vow to the ghost of her childhood. Then she turned to James, the woman who was finally whole. "And I want you beside me." James's composure shattered. He closed the distance between them in a single stride, his eyes dark with relieved, consuming emotion. He took her hands, bringing them to his lips, his voice breaking with the truth he had carried in his heart for weeks. "You were never destined to be a companion." He lifted his gaze to hers, the love undeniable, unshakable. "You were destined, always, to be loved." He pulled her into his embrace, kissing away the last of her tears, the tears of fear, of past loss, and of current overwhelming joy. It was a kiss of truth, passion, and destiny. Charlotte Ravensleigh, the true heiress, stepped forward into the full light of her life, James Ashford at her side, ready to build a life forged of truth, courage, and the love that was always waiting for her to reclaim.